Now, without wishing to sound too glib, the rollout of 5G is continuing at a fairly steady, unspectacular pace. It's certainly less of a big bang and more of a slow burn, which is quite unlike 4G, where we saw subscriber growth driven by new innovations such as modern smartphones and also the emergence of the App Store and mobile applications. And certainly 5G seems to be searching for that killer use case that will really justify additional expense in the eyes of subscribers. Now, of course, we talk about many exciting use cases with 5G. So we've got real-time application support for applications such as virtual reality and augmented reality, which require very low levels of latency and sometimes high data throughput rates that can only be provided by 5G. We've got other things such as potential IoT smart city deployments, for example, and even through to exciting things such as digital twins, for example, where we can create a digital replica of a physical system. Now, the problem that 5G has is, will it deliver enough of a return on investment to justify extensive investment in the potential next generation of mobile technology? And now, if we take a look at the state of play with regards to the rollout of 5G globally, now, what we can see here is that growth is fairly modest, and certainly the next year to 18 months are going to be significant if we really see 5G develop and grow, because the key thing to say at the outset is that for all of the exciting use cases that have been put forward for 5G, they are all reliant and dependent on 5G standalone. And to be clear, the difference here is that many operators have chosen to roll out non-standalone 5G. In other words, they are supplementing the coverage provided by their 4G networks by integrating elements of the 5G radio access network, but still utilizing the 4G core. And through technologies such as dual connectivity, we're able to increase data rates for subscribers, but really we don't get that full flavor of 5G unless we have a standalone network. So if we take a look then at some key metrics, and these are taken from the last quarter of 2023. So we can see that we've got 578 operators, or around that number, across 173 countries investing in 5G currently. And this comes with the usual caveat that this could be anything from very, very early research all the way through to pre-deployment networks. Next, we have the number of commercially launched networks. So this includes fixed wireless access networks where 5G is being used to provide effectively broadband access to residential or business customers. So we can see there, if we break that down, we've got 152 fixed wireless access networks. This makes up quite a significant proportion. Next, we have that critical figure in relation to standalone and non-standalone. And the surprising thing here is just how few standalone networks there are currently in operation. So we can see, although we have 209 non-standalone networks, we've only got 43. There may have been one or two more since the statistics were released, but certainly not the expected growth. Now, the good news here is that there are 121 operators across 54 countries that are currently investing in standalone 5G. So we can expect to see the number of standalone networks grow steadily over the next 18 months. In terms of the devices themselves, we won't dwell too much on this, but there are now 2,148 5G devices, of which 1,756 are commercially available to consumers. And of that number, just over 1,000 are 5G phones. So this will also include things such as 5G modems that might be in use, any IoT devices that utilize 5G connectivity as well. And then finally, if we take a look at the most popular frequency bands, we don't see much of a change here. So globally, the most popular bands tend to be N77 and N78. Now, another thing that might be quite useful to look at is if we compare the numbers between quarter 3 and quarter 4 from 2023. And a picture emerges here of very, very slow growth. And hopefully, this is something that we see start to change over the next 12 months, and we'll see an acceleration in the numbers of 5G, standalone 5G networks being launched. So in terms of commercially launched 5G networks, this could be either non-standalone or standalone. We saw an increase of just 9% between quarter 3 and quarter 4. Countries investing, similar picture, 10%. Now, in terms of non-standalone, so between quarter 3 and quarter 4, there were no new launches of non-standalone networks. This isn't really surprising, since the majority of operators, of service providers that are electing to roll out 5G networks, it makes sense that actually the majority will have rolled out non-standalone by now, and for many, the picture will move to launching standalone versions of 5G. Now, looking specifically at standalone then, we can see very, in terms of growth, we see very, very limited growth. So I think it was an additional one operator launched standalone 5G between quarter 3 and quarter 4. And then finally, in terms of fixed wireless access, again, fairly modest growth between the quarters there. So again, as I mentioned at the start, this really paints a picture of quite slow and probably slower than expected growth in terms of 5G. And the knock-on impact when it comes to considering investment in future generations, so for 6G, for example, is, in terms of the kind of maturation period of 5G, we'd expect it to now be reaching its maturity with the middle of the decade, and as we might have seen with previous generations, we may expect to be further along by now. So this may, of course, have an impact on how operators and service providers choose to invest in future generations and how they approach this investment. Now, if we break this down a little further, one of the more worrying trends with 5G is the potential decline in average revenue per user, or ARPU. And we can see this was an estimate from 2022, and this is likely to decrease even further according to more current estimates. But we can see that over time, we can expect a decrease in revenue per user. Now, there may be a number of reasons for this. Now, it's often said that customers don't pay for the technology, they pay for new experiences. And it's really important, if 5G is to deliver a significant return on investment, that actually we really bring some of these key use cases to market. And at the moment, many of these use cases are still stuck in the test phase with pilot projects, and many of which, so things such as network slicing, for example, are really yet to see that killer use case in terms of a real key application where it can be significant. So in terms of, from the mobile service provider's point of view, this is a slightly alarming trend. And as I say, the figures that we have here are based on 2022. We can expect revenues to fall even more, to around the €6 mark per user by 2027. So again, returning to that question of whether 5G is returning a significant enough return on investment, well, at this stage, that remains questionable. Now, in terms of some key challenges for mobile service providers when it comes to the rolling out and the maintenance of their 5G networks, well, first of all, we've got cost. Service providers are likely to have incurred significant capital expenditure, certainly in terms of the radio side, in terms of rolling out a completely new radio access network and all of the technology associated with that. Now, there are some mitigating factors here. So the fact that we've shifted to containerized software-based network functions, for example, may be seen as a cost mitigation. But this, of course, depends entirely on their implementation. Many service providers have had to grapple with a completely new way of doing things. And this perhaps feeds into the third point on screen here of complexity. So yes, 5G has brought with it some great new innovation, but it's also brought some challenges in terms of not only implementing, but also maintaining the network. We've also got competition here, so it's becoming increasingly hard for mobile service providers to differentiate themselves in the market. And it may be that there is some scope for new services, and perhaps services and applications offer a way for service providers to differentiate themselves from one another. And if you think in the past, often they were differentiated on things such as pricing or coverage. And what we're seeing now is that for many service providers in many countries across the world, these are all fairly similar, and as such, it does become increasingly harder to really stand out in the market. And finally, we have two more points, targeting new market verticals. Now, the success of 5G, certainly in terms of return on investment, perhaps hinges on the ability of a mobile service provider to effectively target new market verticals with new products and services. So if we take network slicing, for example, we've seen lots of test projects across numerous different market verticals, but really yet to see, a significant commercial implementation of network slicing where we can really make a compelling case for this as a business proposition. And then finally, we have device support. So service providers need to ensure that they can support a wide range of devices. And of course, this isn't just smartphones. This is different IoT devices and different IoT technologies and platforms. And again, really, we're coming back to that differentiating factor. Some service providers may be able to steal a march by being able to offer a kind of broad range of compatibility across lots of different devices that can utilize 5G connectivity. Now, as we alluded to earlier, the cost and the complexity of deploying new infrastructure has been significant. And this is certainly something that will influence the thinking of mobile service providers as we look towards the next generation of mobile technology. Now, with the use of higher frequencies, this will necessitate greater cell densification. And of course, it will be extremely challenging for service providers to deploy the required level of radio hardware while still delivering a return on investment and profitability. Now, it may be that there are different avenues that can be explored here. So things such as network sharing agreements, such as those that we see presently with MOCN and MORAN, multi-operator core network, and multi-operator radio access networks. We may also see the model of neutral host networks, where radio access networks are implemented and maintained by a third party and effectively leased back to mobile service providers. And we'll talk about that later on. Now, network slicing has been mooted as a way of targeting new market verticals and delivering new sources of revenue for mobile service providers. So it's no longer enough for service providers to rely on consumers with handsets paying a monthly subscription. Certainly, if 5G is to deliver a significant return on investment, this is dependent on being able to target new market verticals with new products and services. And we can see there are a lot of key use cases here for network slicing. And indeed, for each of these different areas, we've seen test projects and pilot projects that have delivered promising results, but we're yet to see a compelling value proposition for network slicing. And it will certainly be interesting to see how this develops over the next few years. Now, as I've already briefly mentioned, one of the ways that mobile service providers can mitigate the costs and complexity of rolling out and maintaining a radio access network is through the use of neutral host networks. And we can think of these as a natural progression from the existing network sharing that we see between operators. The difference here lies in the ownership of the network. So in this instance, we might see a single third-party entity deploy and manage and maintain a radio access network and lease access back to multiple different mobile service providers. Now, the benefit here is this frees up operators from first of all, the cost of deploying a new radio access network and maintaining that network, but it also allows them to focus on other areas of their business, such as providing new and innovative services to their subscribers. Now, another benefit here is that we can also allow site owners to provide access to a small-scale radio access network. So we might see small cell deployments, for example, in areas such as sports stadiums or concert venues, where the owners of these venues will provide that radio equipment and effectively, as I mentioned earlier, will lease that to mobile service providers. Now, the benefit here is that for a venue such as a concert venue, for example, where we may see this at capacity maybe once a week, for example, it isn't cost effective for a mobile service provider to extend coverage and capacity in this area, but there is an incentive for the site owner to do that because it provides an additional benefit to concert goers, for example, or attendees to sports events and so on and so forth. So this is a model that we may expect to see moving forward into the next generation. Now, finally, as we move towards 6G, one approach that has been mooted is that we may see a software-based upgrade. Now, certainly with some of the newer radio access technology that's being deployed, there is the ability for us to utilise the existing physical radio access network whilst also being able to upgrade things such as the modulation scheme, for example, that would allow us to deliver greater data rates. Now, some of the performance capabilities for 6G that have already been speculated on are quite ambitious, and it remains to be seen whether a software-only update will be viable, but certainly many key industry players are already discussing this idea as a potential next step for 6G. And this certainly makes sense when you consider the significant expense and perhaps the slow rollout and slow growth of 5G, that it makes sense that many mobile service providers may look to play it safe when it comes to the next generation.